The line shook, and something immediately flew out of the darkness toward her. Finn yelped, trying to jump away, but the object, a rusty nail, shot directly toward her. Suddenly, something grabbed the nail, ripping it away and throwing it back out in the darkness. Finn came up from her roll in a tense crouch, mist cloak fluttering around her. She scanned the darkness, then glanced at Kelsier, who was chuckling softly. "I should have known you'd try that," he said. Finn flushed in embarrassment. "Come on," he said, waving her over. "No harm done." "The nail attacked me!" "Actually, you kind of attacked yourself," Kelsier said. "I'll explain what you did in a moment. First, there's something you need to understand about elemency." "Another rule?" "More a philosophy," Kelsier said. "It has to do with consequences." Finn frowned. "What do you mean?" "Every action we take has consequences, Finn," Kelsier said. "I found that in both elemency and life, the person who can best judge the consequences of their actions will be most successful." In this excerpt from Brandon Sanderson's Mistborn: The Final Empire, Kelsier taught Finn a lesson on using her powers wisely, but he might as well have taught us writers an important lesson on storytelling. What Kelsier briefly touches on is cause and effect. If you think about it, even when we're born, we are brought into a world that has already been in existence for a very long time. And the people receiving us already have a whole life behind them, filled with experiences, hardships, and dreams. As writers, we're often told to start a novel with something already happening. We're told to cut the throat clearing and skip the waking up scenes to get directly to the action. And that's because, just like life itself, stories don't start at the beginning. Stories start in the middle, in medias res. In medias res is a Latin phrase meaning in the middle of things. The opposite term is called ab ovo, which means from the egg, or ab initio, which means from the beginning. In English literature, these terms were brought to attention by Horace's Ars Poetica, in which he describes his ideal epic poet as one who does not begin the Trojan War from the double egg, the absolute beginning of events, but snatches the listener into the middle of things. Lawrence Sterne famously rejected this approach in the novel The Life and Opinions of Tristram Shandy, Gentleman. Although it is worth mentioning that Sterne wrote memoirs and biographies, which makes his advocacy for starting from the very beginning understandable. If you ever questioned whether you opened your novel with the right scene, it's probably not. See, the thing is, there can only be one true moment where your protagonist's story starts. The last scene in a protagonist's backstory should be the event that brought them to the first scene on page 1. In medias res is the line that separates backstory from story. The novel is only the second half of the story. Backstory is the first. It's where we find the root cause of the conflicts and dilemmas we meet our protagonists in on page 1, when the past and present collide. In order to know where a story starts, we have to first understand what a story is. Essentially, a story is about a character's struggle with a specific inner dilemma that escalated to a point they can no longer deny it, and how the plot forces them to become aware of this problem in order to change as a person. Or not, if it's a tragedy. So story is about change, but not only that. It's about a specific change, caused by a specific problem that hurts your particular character more than it would anyone else, given who they are.
Let me tell you about a young guy.
But here's the thing. How do you know a situation is particularly upsetting or unexpected for your character if you don't know what they believed would happen given their prior experiences? Even more important, how would your readers know why the situation is particularly unusual for this character if they have no idea who they are or how they've always lived their lives?
Slippin' Jimmy. What the hell kind of name is that?
In medias res is there to ensure that you open your novel where your story begins, and that this opening introduces a character by how they act. This sounds simple, it's really not. In fact, there are many misconceptions about in medias res. Let's briefly discuss each of them to avoid their pitfalls. In medias res means opening your novel in the middle of action. The most common notion about in medias res is that it means we should start our stories in the middle of an action-packed scene and explain the situation later. The problem with that approach is that your readers are missing the why behind the action, so the events themselves read as a bunch of arbitrary things that happen. The good news is that you can catch this pitfall two ways. You either start wondering if you have started your novel with the right scene because it could technically be replaced with any other scene, or you have been able to change the opening of your scene without it having any consequences for your character's backstory or the following events in the story. This brings us to the second misconception. In medias res is a plot device. There are a couple of writing techniques out there, such as the cold open, often used in screenwriting, that touch on the same principle as starting your story in the middle of action. Because this is a popular method for genres like thrillers, action, and adventure, in medias res is often seen as a plot device. But this makes it seem like an optional writing technique rather than a fundamental principle of storytelling. The truth is, all stories start in medias res. Because, just like Kelsier pointed out, all actions have consequences. You cannot have an after without a before. Writing in medias res requires a great deal of digging into your character's backstory, because how are you going to set up your character's change if you don't know what they're changing from? Your character got there for a reason. It's important that we see glimpses of this reason in the opening pages, so the reader understands the real issue that the story will be about. This gives meaning to the surface events, so it doesn't read like a bunch of arbitrary things that happen. Approaching it this way will also help you avoid another common pitfall. In medias res means starting the story as late as possible. When to start a story is actually more important than how, because the when often takes care of the how. It is definitely recommended to cut unnecessary details about a character's life if it's not immediately important to the current events and conflicts, but it should never go at cost of important setup. Remember that readers are completely unfamiliar with the characters when they first tune into your story. They don't have the same knowledge about them that we have as the writer. If you start your story too late, there is no time for the reader to get to know your characters and understand the stakes, which means there's no time for them to care. And that makes for a reliance on the last common pitfall. In medias res is big and exciting. Because you know your reader has no idea just how tragic the opening scene is for your protagonist, or why it matters. You may feel a need to make the opening scene as gripping and explosive as possible. But sometimes it's the subtleties that have the most impact. Think about a well-timed comeback, a punchline, or the passive-aggressive notes that your roommate always left around your dorm when you left a single dirty mug on the kitchen counter. A story is never about the external plot events. It's about how external problems force us to become aware of our internal problems so that we can change. So even if you start your novel with a big and exciting action-packed scene, complete with explosions in the background, the real impact of that scene will be in the subtleties, because that's where the meaning is. A bank robbery, a hostage drama, a stairwell full of police officers on their way to storm an apartment. It was easy to get to this point, much easier than you think. All it took was one single really bad idea. This story is about a lot of things, but mostly about idiots. So it needs saying from the outset that it's always very easy to declare that other people are idiots, but only if you forget how idiotically difficult being human is, especially if you have other people you're trying to be a reasonably good human being for. Writing a compelling novel opening in medias res is best demonstrated through analyzing a story that does it well. The opening scene in Avatar The Last Airbender shows us two siblings, Katara and Sokka, on a fishing trip. Their goal? Catch a fish. The execution, however, is what hooks us to these characters and the world. Get it? Like a fishing hook? I'm so funny. Sokka's first words to his sister are, "Watch and learn, Katara. This is how you catch a fish." Immediately, we get a sense of who this character is. A bit of a know-it-all, trying to impress others. Maybe a form of overcompensation for a lack of self-esteem. Meanwhile, we see Katara use a much more efficient method. She's trying to get her brother's attention as she struggles to hold the fish in her water bubble. Not only does this introduce us to the most interesting part of this world, elemental bending, but it also tells us Katara is very new at it, which strikes us as odd, because if this has been her everyday life, then how come she's still so bad at it? It's the perfect setup for what her arc will be about, and a little glimpse into her goal. After Katara loses control over her waterbending and gets her brother soaked, Sokka is quick to blame his sister for always making him the target of her failures. Another interesting tell about the way he's probably jealous of his sister's ability, maybe because he doesn't have it. So maybe it's not common for people to be able to waterbend, and that could explain why Katara isn't very good at it, as she has to figure it out on her own. Notice how we're already starting to ask questions. Now that we know more about this world and these characters, we're invested and ready to learn more. The pacing picks up as the siblings head into a rapid stream, trying to dodge dangerous ice blocks in the water. Katara yells out directions, which Sokka fails to follow, or just blatantly ignores, causing their boat to get crushed between the icy rocks and leaving them stranded on a patch of ice. They bicker about whose fault it was, with each argument revealing more about them individually. We can now definitely tell Sokka has a misogynistic worldview, feels insecure about his inability to waterbend like his sister, and has somewhat of a pessimistic attitude. When Katara finally snaps into a heated rant, she reveals that she had needed to step into her mom's role when she died, while her brother was off playing soldier. This informs us why Sokka may feel so insecure about his inability to bend, as obviously that would have been a great asset on the front lines. As Katara's anger rises to a boiling point, she accidentally destroys a glacier. This is when we find out that Katara's mastery over her waterbending requires some urgency, as we've now seen what the consequences could be if she doesn't learn to control her ability. But we also remember what sparked her anger in the first place, Sokka's accusations. So we see in what way both characters need to grow, why these changes are necessary, and what it's building up to. We already have an expectation of what their arcs will look like, and so at this point we can decide if we're on for the ride. And that is when the siblings encounter the unusual glowing iceberg that forms the inciting incident of the story. Notice that in all of these events, both Katara and Sokka have already been actively pursuing their goals, but have also been actively held back by their flaws and misbeliefs. Sokka sees this fishing trip as training to become a warrior, but is quickly reminded of his biggest obstacle as he watches his sister be a lot more effective with her waterbending. Katara sees this fishing expedition as an opportunity to learn waterbending, but realizes that she's still miles away from where she wants to be with it, and she's probably going to need help if she ever were to become a master. The opening scene of Avatar The Last Airbender identifies a few crucial elements of starting your novel in medias res. Make the change feel earned. Find a scene in which your character takes an action that characterizes them as a person in a way that indicates this is how they've always been, because that way your readers will be able to gauge how difficult this change is going to be for them, making their final transformation feel earned rather than plotted. Make the change necessary. This very action should also tell us something about how they could have gotten themselves in this situation in the first place. You may have heard this quote before: "How you do anything is how you do everything." In the case of storytelling, this means your character's first action should be a good indication of how they approach most things in life, and how it's quickly ruining their life. This will convey to your reader why the change is necessary, giving your character's arc a sense of urgency. Like, hey buddy, if you don't quickly change your ways, things will be bad. Make us curious. Writers are often anxious about giving too much away in the opening pages, but the paradox of in medias res is that the more you give away, the more eager your readers are to find out more. Understanding leads to questions. It's kind of when you're introduced to a new subject in school that you're absolutely clueless about. You have no idea what to even ask, and so you slouch in your seat as your mind wanders to the snack in your backpack because you don't feel engaged. It's only once you understand that you lose a sock every time you put them in the washing machine that you can start asking, if a washing machine is supposed to be closed, then where do they go? Make the change active. From this first scene in medias res, your reader should be able to see how things are still escalating. You never want to make self-destructive beliefs stagnant. You want a misbelief to be actively ruining a character's life. This is also a great test for us writers to know if our chosen plot problem is big enough to sustain an entire novel, and if our character's misbelief is serious enough to keep escalating into ever-rising stakes and consequences. This is important to create suspense and anticipation in the reader, who will keep wondering, how bad is this still going to get? That question alone will keep them engaged, knowing things can and probably will still get worse. It also provides a sense of irony, as your reader will hit the end of the novel when the world has crumbled underneath your protagonist's feet, remembering it all started with an innocent fishing trip. Readers connect with the story as they reflect on the protagonist's journey. With all this in mind, you may feel a little confused as to where to start writing: the past, the present, or the future. The answer? It doesn't matter. Stories are linear, but writing is not. In order to make a story feel connected and cohesive, we have to write with the end in mind. Some writers even write backwards. But then we also have to know what happened in a character's past to understand their present, how they will respond to it, and how it leads them to their future position. The creative process is chaotic, because art imitates life, and we barely understand life itself. All we know is that we weren't the first, and we won't be the last. Or, as American novelist Mona Simpson so elegantly put it, we all, in the end, die in medias res, in the middle of a story, of many stories.